At first glance, Maplewood Grove looked like the kind of neighborhood real estate agents loved to photograph. Neatly trimmed lawns stretched evenly from house to house. Driveways were clean. Sidewalks were quiet. American flags fluttered politely on porches, and on weekends, you could smell fresh-cut grass and backyard barbecues drifting through the air. It was the kind of place where people waved, nodded, and mostly minded their own business. Nobody was rich, nobody was struggling, and nobody wanted trouble.
This document
That balance,
finalizes the
comfortable,
transfer of authority
predictable,
to the new
peaceful,
committee.
was exactly
Understood.
why
We
people
accept.
moved there. And that was also why no one noticed Karen at first. Karen moved into Maplewood Grove about 5 years earlier, into a modest 2-story home on the corner lot. She introduced herself to neighbors with tight smiles and firm handshakes, always mentioning how much she valued order and strong communities. At first she seemed harmless, helpful even. She volunteered to organize neighborhood
Look,
yard sales.
She's still out
She
there.
offered to collect
Don't let her
HOA
see us.
dues
I'm
for elderly
scared.
residents who had trouble mailing checks. She remembered everyone's name, their pets, their kids, and their schedules. People mistook her attentiveness for kindness. What they didn't realize was that Karen wasn't observing out of friendliness. She was cataloging. The Maplewood Grove HOA was famously low effort. Meetings were rare. Rules were simple. The board consisted of 3 exhausted volunteers who mostly existed to approve maintenance budgets and send out the occasional reminder email about trash pickup schedules. Nobody wanted power. Nobody wanted drama. And that vacuum, quiet, unguarded, and complacent, was exactly where Karen thrived. Karen began attending every HOA meeting. While others sat silently, she spoke confidently, peppering her comments with phrases like industry standards and best practices, even though no one knew what industry she was referring to. She criticized minor things at first, a faded fence here, a leaning mailbox there. The board members, relieved that someone cared enough to speak up, welcomed her input. When she offered to help enforce standards, they didn't hesitate. They didn't check the bylaws. They didn't define limits. They just nodded. That was the first mistake. Within months, Karen had unofficially positioned herself as the neighborhood's rule enforcer. She didn't have a title yet, but she acted like she did. She began reminding neighbors about rules they didn't even remember agreeing to. She'd knock on doors holding printed pages of HOA guidelines, selectively highlighted to support whatever point she was making that day. If someone questioned her, she'd smile thinly and say, "I'm just trying to protect all of us." And for a while it worked. People complied, not because they believed her, but because they didn't want conflict. They repainted small sections of trim. They moved trash cans a few feet farther from the curb. They trimmed hedges an inch shorter than necessary. Karen interpreted compliance not as cooperation, but as validation. Every small victory fed her sense of authority. Every neighbor who quietly obeyed reinforced the idea that she was indispensable. Soon, Karen proposed creating a new HOA role, Neighborhood Standards Coordinator. It sounded official, responsible, necessary. She pitched it as a way to take pressure off the board and ensure consistency. The board, already burned out and eager to delegate, approved it unanimously, without a vote from residents, without legal review, and without realizing they had just handed a megaphone to the loudest voice in the room. Karen printed business cards within a week. With her new title came a clipboard, then a binder, then a digital camera. Karen started taking photos of homes, sometimes from the sidewalk, sometimes uncomfortably close to windows. She documented everything. Slightly uneven grass. Peeling paint no one else noticed. Decorations that stayed up too long after holidays. Her emails became longer, colder, and more frequent. She stopped asking. She started informing. This is a courtesy notice. This will need to be corrected. Failure to comply may result in further action. No one knew what further action meant, but the implication was enough. Karen walked Maplewood Grove every morning like clockwork. Same route. Same pace. Same clipboard tucked against her chest like a badge. Neighbors learned to recognize the sound of her shoes on concrete and the click of her camera. Some avoided eye contact. Others waved nervously. Karen waved back, already writing. The power changed her. She no longer smiled at block parties. She stopped chatting. Conversations became lectures. Suggestions became orders. And somewhere along the way, Karen stopped seeing neighbors as people and started seeing them as problems waiting to be corrected. What Karen didn't realize, what she never even considered, was that the same quiet neighborhood that allowed her rise was also watching, listening, remembering. And the more power she took, the closer she came to the moment it would all unravel. By the time Karen realized she enjoyed power, It was already too late for Maplewood Grove. What had once been courtesy notices quietly transformed into something far more aggressive. The tone of Karen's emails changed first. Gone were the polite greetings and community-focused language. In their place came cold subject lines written in all caps: violation notice, final warning, immediate action required. The messages arrived early in the morning, sometimes before sunrise, sitting in residents' inboxes like threats waiting to be opened. People began starting their days with anxiety, wondering what new offense Karen had discovered overnight. And Karen was discovering things. Or inventing them. One homeowner received a warning for having curtains that were visible from the street and visually inconsistent. Another was told their driveway had an unauthorized oil stain, even though the mark had been there long before Karen moved in. A single mother was cited for leaving her trash can out for 2 extra hours because she worked a late shift. Karen didn't ask. She didn't care. She documented. She demanded compliance. At first, people still tried to reason with her. They emailed back politely. They explained circumstances. They apologized for inconveniences they didn't believe were real problems. Karen responded with form letters, copied and pasted, signed with her full name and unofficial title. Any attempt at conversation was shut down. Any hint of disagreement was met with thinly veiled threats about fines, liens, and further enforcement measures. The abuse escalated quietly the way it always does, slow enough that no single incident felt worth fighting over, but constant enough to wear everyone down. Karen began knocking on doors. Not during reasonable hours. Not with warning. She knocked mid-afternoon, early mornings, sometimes evenings when families were eating dinner. She stood too close when doors opened, clipboard angled just right so people could see pages filled with notes about their home. If someone didn't answer, she taped notices directly to doors or windows, visible to anyone walking by. It wasn't about correction anymore. It was about humiliation. Children noticed first. Parents reported their kids asking why the lady with the clipboard kept taking pictures of their house. Why she stared at their bikes. Why she frowned at chalk drawings on the sidewalk. One family found a violation notice taped next to their child's hand-drawn welcome sign, citing it as unauthorized signage. The father ripped it down in anger. Karen returned the next day and issued another notice for removal of official HOA documentation. That's when fear began replacing annoyance. Residents stopped sitting on their porches. Garage doors stayed closed. Decorations disappeared. People delayed mowing, repainting, or repairing anything because any change risked attracting Karen's attention. She had become a constant presence, uninvited, unaccountable, and increasingly aggressive. Behind closed doors, neighbors whispered. They compared notes quietly, unsure if others were experiencing the same thing or if they were being singled out. Karen had a way of making each person feel uniquely targeted. Her language was precise, isolating. Repeated violations. Ongoing noncompliance. Pattern of disregard. Words designed to make recipients doubt themselves. And then came the fines. No announcement. No vote. No board communication. Just invoices, slipped into mailboxes or emailed as PDFs, demanding payment within 10 days. The amounts varied. $75, $150, $500. The reasons were vague. Aesthetic noncompliance. Failure to meet community standards. When questioned, Karen responded that fines were standard procedure, and refusal to pay could result in legal consequences. Some people paid. Not because they believed the fines were legitimate but because they were scared. HOA horror stories circulated online. Homes foreclosed over unpaid fees, families buried in legal costs. Karen leaned into that fear deliberately. She referenced liens casually, dropping the word into emails like a weapon. She never explained the process. She didn't have to. The implication did the work for her. Others refused. Those residents became Karen's favorites. She documented them obsessively. Multiple notices per week. Photos from different angles. Follow-up emails marked urgent. One homeowner counted 7 violations in 10 days, including one for standing water after a rainstorm. Karen claimed it posed a mosquito risk. When the homeowner laughed and asked if she was serious, Karen stared back coldly and said, "This is not a joke." Her behavior crossed from enforcement into harassment. She waited near driveways. She confronted people in public. She raised her voice during disputes, then later claimed she'd been threatened. She CC'd board members selectively, presenting carefully curated narratives that made residents look hostile and uncooperative. The board, distant and disengaged, often sided with Karen by default, or didn't respond at all. Silence became complicity. Karen interpreted the lack of pushback as approval. Her confidence grew. Her demands became more extreme. She began proposing changes no one asked for: mandatory repainting schedules, restrictions on guests, limits on outdoor activity. She framed control as protection, dominance as responsibility. But what Karen failed to see was the shift happening beneath the surface. Fear was turning into anger. Compliance was turning into resentment. And resentment, when shared quietly among neighbors, has a way of becoming something far more dangerous to unchecked power. By the end of episode 2, Karen believed she was untouchable. She was wrong. The fines changed everything. Up until now, Karen's behavior had existed in a gray area. Annoying, intimidating, but still just close enough to plausibly legal that most residents hesitated to challenge her outright. But the moment money entered the equation, fear spread through Maplewood Grove like a virus. A violation notice could be ignored. A threat could be rationalized. But a demand for payment, especially one wrapped in legal-sounding language, hit differently. The invoices arrived quietly. Some were slipped into mailboxes without envelopes. Others appeared as PDF attachments in late-night emails stamped with phrases like "final notice" and "payment due immediately." There was no explanation of how the fines were calculated, no reference to a board vote, and no instructions for appeal. Just a dollar amount, a deadline, and a warning about potential escalation. Residents stared at the numbers in disbelief. $75 for a trash can left out too long. $154, improper exterior appearance. $500 for repeat noncompliance. The language was deliberately vague, flexible enough to mean whatever Karen wanted it to mean that day. When people asked for clarification, Karen didn't provide it. She simply repeated the demand. Fear took hold fast. Parents worried about their homes. Retirees worried about their savings. Renters worried their landlords would blame them. People who had never missed a payment on anything in their lives suddenly faced the possibility, real or imagined, of legal action over a flower pot or a patch of grass. Karen referenced liens often now, dropping the word into emails the way someone might tap a knife on a table. She never explained the process. She didn't need to. Everyone had heard stories. Some residents paid immediately, hoping to make the problem go away. Karen noticed. Those homes received fewer notices afterward, reinforcing the idea that obedience was rewarded. Others hesitated, unsure whether the fines were legitimate. Karen escalated quickly in those cases. Second notices followed within days. Then third. Each more urgent than the last. The amounts increased. Late fees appeared out of nowhere. A few residents found their names misspelled on invoices, a detail that would later matter far more than anyone realized. The fear wasn't just financial. It was psychological. People stopped talking openly. Group chats went silent. Neighbors who once shared coffee avoided each other, unsure who might report whom. Karen had turned compliance into a social weapon. Anyone who resisted risked becoming an example. Anyone who spoke up risked retaliation. Isolation was no longer accidental. It was engineered. One elderly couple received a fine for failure to maintain lawn uniformity. Their grass was patchy from drought, something they couldn't afford to fix. When they called Karen to explain, she responded flatly that exceptions undermine standards. The husband paid the fine in cash and asked for a receipt. Karen refused, saying receipts were not required. He later told a neighbor he felt like he'd been shaken down. Others weren't so compliant. A young couple refused to pay a $300 fine for having a portable basketball hoop in their driveway. Karen responded by issuing 3 additional violations in a single week. One cited the hoop. Another cited noise concerns. The third accused them of hostile behavior for questioning her authority in an email. Karen warned them that continued defiance could result in legal remedies. They started documenting everything. Photos, emails, dates, times. They weren't alone. Quietly, discreetly, residents began building private folders filled with Karen's messages. What felt like paranoia at first slowly revealed itself as survival. People sensed something was deeply wrong, even if they couldn't yet name it. The HOA board remained silent. Emails sent to board members went unanswered. Meeting requests were delayed or ignored. Some residents suspected Karen was controlling the narrative behind the scenes, presenting herself as the victim of uncooperative homeowners. Others feared the board simply didn't care enough to intervene. Either way, the message was clear. No one was coming to help. And that's when the fear peaked. Not with a loud threat. Not with a confrontation. But with a single email sent late on a Sunday night, bearing the subject line, "Notice of Escalation." Karen claimed unpaid fines could result in liens, legal action, and additional costs incurred by the homeowner. She didn't cite laws. She didn't attach bylaws. She didn't need to. By now, residents were conditioned to panic first and question later. Homes that once felt safe now felt fragile. Every knock at the door raised heart rates. Every unfamiliar car slowed conversations mid-sentence. Karen had succeeded in creating an atmosphere where people self-policed, self-censored, and self-blamed. But fear has a breaking point. And somewhere in Maplewood Grove, someone was about to stop being afraid and start reading the fine print. The investigation didn't begin with a confrontation. It began quietly, the way all real resistance does, with doubt. For weeks, fear had ruled Maplewood Grove. Fines were paid, emails were ignored, and neighbors kept their heads down. But fear has a strange side effect. It makes people replay events over and over, searching for logic where none seems to exist. And eventually, someone always asks the question everyone else is too scared to say out loud. Is this even legal? That question came from Mark. Mark lived 3 houses down from Karen, in a modest home with a carefully kept yard and a habit of minding his own business. He wasn't loud. He wasn't social. Most neighbors only knew him as the guy who waved politely and brought his trash cans in early. What they didn't know was that Mark worked as a paralegal. Reading dense documents wasn't intimidating to him, it was routine. Mark received his 3rd fine on a Thursday morning. $200. Repeat aesthetic violations. No explanation. No appeal process. Just a deadline and a warning about next steps. He stared at the email longer than he should have. Something about it felt off. Not just unfair but sloppy. The language was aggressive but legally vague. Important details were missing. And there was no reference to any specific HOA rule. That was when Mark did something no one else had bothered to do. He opened the bylaws. The Maplewood Grove HOA governing documents were buried on an old website that hadn't been updated in years. The formatting was terrible. The language was dry. And most residents had never read past the first page. Mark printed the entire document and spent his weekend highlighting, annotating, and cross-referencing. What he found made his stomach drop. Karen had no authority to issue fines. No authority to enforce rules. No authority to act independently in any capacity. The bylaws were clear, painfully clear. Fines required a board vote. Notices required documented warnings and an appeal process. Enforcement could only be carried out by the HOA board or a contracted management company. Karen's title, Neighborhood Standards Coordinator, didn't exist anywhere in the documents. She wasn't just overstepping. She was fabricating power. Mark reread the section 3 times to be sure. Then a 4th. The more he read, the worse it got. Karen's threats about liens? Completely false. Her final notices? Meaningless. Her fines? Not just invalid, potentially illegal. Mark didn't celebrate. He didn't feel relief. He felt angry. Not just for himself but for everyone who had paid out of fear. For the elderly couple who handed over cash. For families who lost sleep worrying about their homes. For neighbors who blamed themselves for rules that never existed. Still, Mark knew better than to confront Karen directly. Power doesn't collapse when it's challenged emotionally. It collapses when it's exposed methodically. So he started documenting. He created a folder on his computer labeled HOA. Inside it, he saved every email Karen had sent him. Every notice. Every invoice. He compared them against the bylaws, noting violations of procedure. Missing references. Fabricated authority. False claims. Then he did something risky. He reached out, quietly, to another neighbor. Just one. He chose someone he trusted. Sarah, a nurse who lived at the end of the street. Mark forwarded her a copy of the bylaws with highlighted sections and asked a simple question. Have you been fined too? Sarah responded within minutes. Yes. Twice. That was all it took. 1 conversation became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became a private group chat. Invite only, discreet, carefully worded. No names. No accusations. Just shared experiences. Screenshots. PDFs. Photos of notices taped to doors. The pattern was undeniable. Karen's fines followed no consistent rule. Deadlines varied. Amounts fluctuated. Warnings were skipped entirely. Some residents were targeted relentlessly, others barely at all. The abuse wasn't random, it was strategic. Karen focused on those she believed wouldn't fight back. But now they were fighting back. Not publicly, not loudly, but intelligently. Someone archived Karen's emails in case she deleted them later. Another neighbor requested past HOA meeting minutes and noticed something alarming: there was no record of any vote authorizing fines. Ever. A retired accountant calculated the total amount Karen had collected so far. The number was shocking. Tens of thousands of dollars. Unaccounted for. That discovery changed the tone of the group overnight. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was potential fraud. Still, fear lingered. What if Karen found out? What if she retaliated? What if the HOA board sided with her? Mark reminded everyone of the most important rule of investigation: never reveal your hand until the evidence is airtight. So they waited. They gathered. They prepared. And while Karen continued her morning walks with her clipboard, confident, untouchable, smug, the ground beneath her authority was quietly eroding. She had no idea the neighborhood was no longer afraid. She had no idea she was being investigated. And she definitely had no idea how close she was to losing everything she thought she controlled. The first thing that changed wasn't Karen. It was the silence. For months, Maplewood Grove had existed in a state of quiet tension. Doors closed quickly. Conversations ended when footsteps approached. People learned to keep their frustrations private, believing isolation was safer than solidarity. Karen's greatest success wasn't the fines or the threats. It was convincing everyone they were alone. That illusion shattered the moment neighbors started talking to each other. It began in fragments. A quick message sent late at night. A whispered conversation during a dog walk. A careful knock on a door, followed by the question everyone was finally brave enough to ask: "Has this been happening to you too?" The answers were always the same. Yes. Yes, constantly. Yes, and I thought I was the only one. As stories surfaced, something powerful happened. Fear lost its grip. The shame Karen had cultivated, the idea that violations were personal failures, evaporated when people realized the system was rigged from the start. What felt like individual punishment revealed itself as a coordinated pattern of abuse. The private group chat grew. At first it was cautious. No names. No accusations. Just documentation. People uploaded screenshots of emails, photos of notices, scanned invoices. Someone created folders by date. Someone else organized files by resident. What emerged wasn't chaos, it was structure. The opposite of Karen's arbitrary enforcement. Patterns became undeniable. Karen targeted homes with elderly residents more aggressively. Families with children received higher fines. Renters were pressured indirectly through homeowners. Those who paid once were often left alone. Those who questioned her authority were buried in violations. It wasn't enforcement, it was coercion. And the money. As totals were updated, the mood shifted from anger to disbelief. Tens of thousands of dollars had been collected with no transparency, no receipts, and no HOA accounting records. Where had it gone? Karen claimed it was allocated for future maintenance, but there were no budgets, no deposits, no paper trail. That question united the neighborhood faster than anything else. Money has a way of cutting through fear. A retired teacher suggested a community meeting. Not an HOA meeting. Those were controlled. This would be informal. Off the record. Just neighbors. No emails. No announcements. Word spread quietly, deliberately. A time. A place. Lawn chairs encouraged. On the evening of the meeting, people arrived cautiously at first. Then in waves. Families. Seniors. Couples. Renters. Homeowners who had lived there for decades and others who had moved in recently. Many were meeting properly for the first time. They recognized each other from Karen's photos. From violation notices. From shared anxiety. What surprised everyone was the turnout. Nearly half the neighborhood showed up. At first no one spoke. Years of conditioning don't disappear instantly. Then someone shared their story. Then another. And another. Voices shook at first, then steadied. Anger surfaced, but so did relief. Laughter too, nervous at first, then genuine, as absurd violations were read aloud. A bird feeder. Chalk drawings. Holiday lights. A welcome mat. Hearing them together stripped them of their power. That was when Mark stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply held up a printed copy of the HOA bylaws, thick with highlights and notes. He explained, clearly, calmly, that Karen's actions weren't just unfair. They were unauthorized, illegal, and potentially criminal. The reaction was immediate. People leaned forward. Questions poured out. Could fines be reversed? Could money be recovered? Could Karen retaliate? Mark answered honestly. There were risks, but there was also leverage. Documentation, law, numbers, strength. The group voted, informally but unanimously, to act together. No more individual responses. No more isolated emails. Everything would be collective, transparent, recorded. Karen thrived on fragmentation. Unity was her weakness. Roles formed naturally. One resident handled communication. Another tracked finances. Someone else drafted a timeline of events. A lawyer from a nearby street volunteered to review documents. A tech-savvy teenager helped organize files digitally. The neighborhood, once passive, became organized almost overnight. For the first time, Karen was outmatched. What she didn't know, what she couldn't see from her morning walks, was that the community she believed she controlled was no longer reacting to her. They were preparing. And the next time Karen tried to assert her authority, she wouldn't be facing individuals. She would be facing all of them. Karen knew something was wrong before the email even finished loading. The subject line alone was unfamiliar. Emergency HOA board meeting, mandatory attendance. No friendly phrasing. No flattering language. No praise for her dedication. Just a date, a time, and a location. Neutral. Formal. Final. For the first time since she'd taken control of Maplewood Grove, Karen wasn't the one setting the agenda. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the local community center. A neutral space, not someone's living room, not an informal gathering Karen could dismiss as gossip. The message came directly from the HOA board, CSNG every homeowner in the neighborhood. That detail alone sent a ripple through the community. Karen read it twice, then a third time. She told herself it was nothing. Boards panic sometimes. This was just another chance to explain, to clarify misunderstandings, to remind everyone how much work she'd done for free. She rehearsed her talking points out loud in her kitchen. Standards. Property values. Hostile homeowners. Disorder. She printed her emails. She organized her binders. She even wore her most professional outfit. Neutral colors, conservative cut, authority without warmth. Karen walked into the meeting expecting control. What she found instead was resistance. The room was already full. Nearly every chair was taken. Homeowners stood along the walls. Some sat on the floor. There was no casual chatter, no nervous laughter. Just quiet focus. People nodded at one another, not in fear but in recognition. Karen noticed something immediately and felt a flicker of irritation she quickly buried. They weren't avoiding her eyes anymore. The HOA board sat at a folding table at the front of the room. 3 members, all visibly uncomfortable. They weren't used to crowds. They weren't used to conflict. But tonight they weren't alone. A 4th chair sat beside them, occupied by a lawyer the board had hired earlier that week after receiving the neighborhood's collective letter. Karen hadn't known about that part. The meeting was called to order. The board president cleared his throat and read from prepared notes. He spoke slowly, carefully, choosing words that couldn't be twisted. He explained that the board had received multiple complaints, formal, documented, and consistent, regarding enforcement actions taken by Karen. Karen smiled thinly and waited for her turn. Then the lawyer spoke. He outlined the bylaws, section by section. Calm, precise, unemotional. He explained what authority existed, and what did not. With every sentence, Karen felt something tighten in her chest. These weren't opinions. They were facts. Written, recorded, enforceable. Then came the evidence. Emails were read aloud. Screenshots displayed on a projector. Notices taped to doors. Invoices demanding payment. The lawyer asked simple questions. Can you point to the bylaw authorizing this fine? Who approved this amount? Where was this payment deposited? Karen interrupted. She raised her voice, insisting residents were exaggerating, misinterpreting, being deliberately difficult. She accused the neighborhood of turning against her because she did the hard work no one else wanted to do. She spoke faster now, louder, her composure cracking. The room didn't react. No gasps. No shouting. No arguments. Just silence. And silence, Karen realized too late, meant she no longer controlled the narrative. One by one, residents were invited to speak. Not emotionally. Not angrily. Just factually. An elderly man described paying cash and receiving no receipt. A mother explained being fined while at work, unable to respond within Karen's deadlines. A couple detailed receiving multiple violations in a single week after questioning a fine. Each account was backed by documentation. Karen tried to respond to each one, but the board stopped her. "You'll have time to respond," the president said firmly. "Please let them finish." Karen had never been told to wait before. The final blow came quietly. The accountant, one of the residents, stood up and presented a spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, totals. Money collected without authorization, without accounting, without deposit records. The number at the bottom of the page was impossible to ignore. The board members exchanged looks. This was no longer about overreach. This was about liability. The lawyer leaned forward and spoke the sentence that ended Karen's reign. "Effective immediately, all enforcement actions taken by Ms. Karen are suspended pending investigation." Karen stood up. She protested. She argued. She accused. She demanded. No one responded. The board voted. Unanimously. Karen was removed from all HOA-related duties on the spot. Her clipboard slipped from her hand and hit the floor. For the first time since she'd arrived in Maplewood Grove, Karen had no authority, no audience, and no leverage. She walked out of the room alone. Behind her, the neighborhood didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They simply exhaled, together. Because while Karen's power was gone, the story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Karen didn't disappear after the meeting. She went quiet. And for someone who had lived on attention, authority, and constant enforcement, silence was unbearable. The morning after the board confrontation, Maplewood Grove felt different. Lighter. Garage doors opened again. People lingered outside longer than usual. There was an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Karen no longer walked the sidewalks with her clipboard. No camera clicks echoed between houses. No notices appeared taped to doors. But inside Karen's home, the pressure was building. She began sending emails again, long ones this time. Defensive. Rambling. She insisted she'd been misunderstood. That residents were conspiring against her. That the board had panicked under pressure. She demanded reinstatement. She demanded apologies. She demanded meetings where she could properly explain. No one responded. The HOA board had been advised, firmly, not to engage. Instead, the investigation moved forward. The board's lawyer requested records. Bank statements. Deposit histories. Receipts. Karen was given a deadline to produce documentation supporting the fines she'd collected and the authority under which she'd acted. It was a simple request. Karen missed the deadline. When she did respond, it was with excuses. Files were misplaced. Records were on an old computer. Some payments were temporary holds. Her explanations contradicted earlier statements she'd made, statements the neighborhood had already archived. That was when the tone shifted from administrative to serious. The accountant resident, now formally assisting the board, identified gaps that couldn't be explained away. Payments that never entered HOA accounts. Cash amounts with no trace. Totals that didn't match any approved budget. The word mismanagement appeared in an email. Then liability. Then fraud. Karen was formally notified that she was no longer permitted to represent the HOA in any capacity, contact residents regarding enforcement, or handle HOA-related funds. She was warned, politely but clearly, that further interference could carry legal consequences. Karen responded the only way she knew how. She lashed out. She confronted neighbors in public again, accusing them of lying. She posted vague messages online about mob mentalities and community betrayal. She claimed she'd been bullied, harassed, silenced for doing the right thing. But without authority, her words had no weight. People didn't argue with her. They walked away. That hurt more than any punishment. The refunds came next. The board issued formal notices voiding all fines Karen had issued. Residents were instructed to submit proof of payment for reimbursement. The total amount stunned even those who'd been tracking it. Checks went out. Some people cried when they opened their envelopes, not because of the money, but because it confirmed they hadn't imagined the abuse. They hadn't deserved it. They hadn't been alone. Karen saw the checks. She knew what they meant. The investigation report was finalized within weeks. It detailed unauthorized enforcement, improper handling of funds, intimidation tactics, and failure to comply with HOA bylaws. The board voted unanimously to permanently bar Karen from any HOA role. But consequences didn't stop at the HOA. The board's lawyer advised them, quietly, that certain findings might warrant external review. Especially the missing funds. Especially the cash payments. Especially the false claims of legal authority. Karen received a certified letter shortly after. She didn't share its contents. She didn't have to. Neighbors noticed the moving truck 2 weeks later. Karen packed quickly. No goodbye. No explanation. Just boxes, silence, and a house that went dark. She avoided eye contact. No clipboard. No binder. No authority. Just a woman leaving the neighborhood she once believed she controlled. And that was it. No dramatic arrest. No shouting match. No public apology. Just the slow, undeniable collapse of power built on fear and lies. Karen didn't lose because she was opposed loudly. She lost because people stopped being afraid and started paying attention. The strangest thing about Karen's departure was how quickly the neighborhood adjusted. Not because she hadn't mattered, but because fear, once removed, leaves behind a kind of calm people forget is possible. Maplewood Grove didn't celebrate. There were no banners, no announcements, no victory laps. Life simply resumed. And that, in itself, felt revolutionary. Garage doors stayed open longer. Lawn chairs reappeared on porches. Kids rode bikes without glancing over their shoulders. Neighbors lingered in conversation, rediscovering something they hadn't realized they'd lost: the ability to exist without being watched. The HOA board moved carefully now. Chastened by how close they'd come to disaster, they overcorrected in the best way possible. Meetings were announced well in advance. Agendas were shared publicly. Minutes were posted online. Every decision was documented, voted on, and explained. Authority became transparent instead of assumed. Trust, once broken, isn't rebuilt quickly, but it can be rebuilt deliberately. The board issued a formal apology to the community. Not a defensive one. Not a half measure. A real apology. They acknowledged their failure to supervise, their reliance on a single voice, their mistake in mistaking confidence for competence. People noticed. More residents began attending meetings. Not to argue. Not to dominate. Just to be present. To listen. To understand the systems that govern their lives. Participation replaced passivity. The neighborhood had learned a lesson it would not forget. Individually, many residents processed what had happened in private ways. Some felt anger, belated, sharp, and justified, at how long they'd tolerated the abuse. Others felt guilt for complying, for staying silent, for paying fines they knew felt wrong. Therapists would call it hindsight bias. Survivors simply call it survival. What mattered wasn't what people did under fear. What mattered was what they did once fear lifted. Friendships formed where none had existed before. People who had once only exchanged nods now shared meals, stories, laughter. The shared ordeal created a bond deeper than politeness. They had protected each other, sometimes without realizing it. Even property values changed. Not downward as Karen had constantly warned, but upward. Real estate agents remarked on the strong sense of community and active homeowner involvement. Buyers asked questions about the HOA, and residents answered them honestly, without embarrassment, without fear. Transparency became a selling point. Occasionally, someone would mention Karen. Not with rage. Not even with bitterness. Just as a reference point. Before all that happened. Back when things were tense. When we learned to read the bylaws. Karen became a lesson, not a villain. And that was perhaps the most important transformation of all. The neighborhood understood now that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing helpful intentions, thriving in gaps left by disengagement. Karen hadn't taken control because she was strong. She'd taken control because no one was watching. But people were watching now. They understood that community doesn't maintain itself automatically. It requires attention, participation, the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions early, before fear replaces dialogue. The story of Maplewood Grove spread. Other neighborhoods reached out. Online forums shared the cautionary tale. HOA boards elsewhere revised policies, clarified roles, implemented safeguards. Karen's rise and fall became a warning passed hand to hand. Read the rules, share the power, never let silence substitute for consent. And in Maplewood Grove life went on. Not perfectly. Not without disagreement. But openly. People argued at meetings. They debated paint colors and landscaping budgets and parking rules. But those arguments were public, documented, and resolved collectively. No clipboards in the shadows. No fines without votes. No authority without accountability. The lesson was simple but hard-earned. Fear thrives in isolation. Power thrives in silence. And communities survive when ordinary people choose to pay attention together. Karen had tried to control a neighborhood. Instead, she taught it how to protect itself. If you want, I can now.